midst of the Isser of Achila and Shtia, eating and drinking on Yom Kippur. There's about 12 lines from the bottom. All foods would be included in the prohibition. Omar Papa, if the person who ate on Yom Kippur ate meat and salt that's on it, so there wasn't a kuseves, a date size of each alone, but they combine, they go together, and that it's meant to be eaten together. So therefore, it will combine. The even though that it's not necessarily edible that way. Kiva the achli instrument stuff. Since people eat it that way, it it does combine. And the idea is that it is brining the meat. Nevertheless, it's going to combine. Amar Rish Lakish. Furthermore, Rish Lakish said, "Tzir shel gabi yerek." Somebody's eating vegetables out of a gravy or out of a meat, and it has the juices of the meat, which are a liquid, on the vegetables. The starf l'keseves that would join and combine with the kesev with the vegetables to become a keseves, to the requisite amount or the minimum amount to be held live. So everyone says pshita, of course. Now they're taking mashku. So everyone says, no, I would have thought maybe that's a liquid, and liquid and a solid, the liquid would be like a drink, and would have a different measure, and therefore not combined. Kamash Malan, Kalach Shuri Achla. So it comes to teach us that anything that is enhancing the food itself, it adds flavor and taste. Uchlu, so it is a part of the food and not the drink. Amar Rish Lakish, another teaching of Rish Lakish. To eat on Yom Kippur, you have to. The prohibition is not to benefit, not to. One has to afflict themselves, feel pain in a sense. So if somebody's eating achila gasa on Yom Kippur, that would not count. So what is an achila gasa? There are different levels of achila gasa, it seems, but the achila gasa we're talking about is somebody who is so stuffed that, right? It's just at the end, the beginning of Yom Kippur, they had their suda mafsekes, their meal prior to Yom Kippur, and they are just stuffed. They cannot eat another morsel, and they have no appetite for it, and yet they eat. So that's not a beneficial eating. It is there's no benefit. There's no pleasure. In fact, it could be that it's the opposite. It's really, in a sense, disgusting. And it also is a waste. It's a waste of the food as well. And so that doesn't count as eating. So my time, Ashalei to Uneksiv, it says one who did not afflict themselves, Pratla Mazik. That excludes somebody who actually is hurting themselves, is being detrimental to themselves by eating more, and to the food, because the food is a total waste. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rish Lakish, and another statement in the name of Rish Lakish by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Zar she'achal truma, in a similar vein, where a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat teruma. If a non-Kohen ate teruma, achila gasa, but he did so in an achila gasa. So mashal b'saker. The rule generally is somebody eats teruma has to pay the principal plus 25%, which is considered a chumash, a fifth of the end result. So it's 25%. However, that's not the case in regards to this over here, because he has to pay on principle, but not the punitive 25%. Because the Torah, when it says that you should pay the 25%, it says Ishki Yochel Kodesh. If a man were to eat Kodesh, Teruma, something holy, and it has to be Achila, Pratla Mazik. He's not actually eating it. Yes, he is. The way he's destroying this food is by chewing it, but he's not actually eating it because he's completely full. He's disgusted by eating more, and he's eating it. That's Achila Gasa. Amar Rabbi Yirmi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now Rabbi Yirmi has said something in the name of Rabbi Yochanan in a similar vein. Zar, a non-Kohen, we go to pay Aleph and Aleph. A non-Kohen shekaises sa'irim shel teruma, who is sucking on teruma, on barley of teruma. Mishalim es hakeren vein mishalim es hachodesh. He doesn't pay the 25%. Again, this is not a typical way of eating this, of eating barley, and therefore it would not count as an achila. Rather, it's damaging. So it's it's just a waste of that food. So the wasting of it pays the principal, but not the 25%. Amar Rav Shizvi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Here, Rav Shizvi is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Zor Shabala Shazifim. This one's pretty disgusting. And somebody swallows plums whole, okay? And these are shel teruma. They were consecrated and given to the Kohen as teruma, and somebody eats them. Now v'hikia, and then as he swallowed it whole, and then he vomited it up, and it's still whole. V'achla nachem, and someone else eats them. Yeah. So Risha Misham is like the first fellow is going to pay the principal plus the 25%. Sheni Ein Mishalim Ela the Me'etzim Bilbad. The second one does not have to pay. All he has to pay is the value of it as fuel, so the price of a piece of wood that size, because it's only fuel at that point. And it's not necessarily because it became non-food when somebody swallowed it. It's not that it's disgusting per se, but it became non-sanctified. And once the one person has swallowed it, it's no longer sanctified because he stole it from Truma, acquired it, and became fully responsible for 125% of this. So at the time the second person ate it, he's no longer held responsible for anything but its value as fuel. Elsewhere, there's a discussion about what is actually the food status of food that was eaten and puked up and is still in a.
Don't get too much detail on that one.
No, but I know it was so I would. The cat coffee. Yes, the cat coffee, but that's the other way around. It goes all the way. Yeah, that doesn't come back up. But honey, Eric, you eat honey?
Once in a while. Nothing to correct.
Food and drink do not combine to the requisite amount. Montana, whose opinion is this? So Rav Chisda is said, Rav Chisda was one of the heads of the academy in Babel. So he said it's actually a machlokas. It's unclear that this is a machlokas, and this opinion in our Mishnah that they don't combine Rabbi Yeshua is the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. The Tanan, as we learn, Kollel Amar Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua said a rule. Kol shetumasa v'shiyura is shaveh. All matters in Tumah, where we know in Tumah there's something that's coming for one day, something that's coming for that day, some things are 7 days. So anything that its Tumah is equal, meaning they have the same rules in regards to the length of Tumah, and also there in Tumah we've seen various amounts that one would become tummy from Kisaira, a barley size, Ka'adasha, a bean size, half olive size. So there are different measures. So if the two items that we're combining for Tumah are both their measure of how much is required is the same, as well as once somebody becomes tummy, what the rules are, how long the tumah is the same. So then mitzdarif, then the two things can combine to create tumah. However, if tumasav l'shira, if they have the same tumah but not the same measure required for becoming tumah, shira v'loy tumas, or it has the same measure in susceptibility for tumah, but not in the length of time that the tumah is going to be on the person. Or if it doesn't have either similar payment stuff, so then they will not combine. So we see in order for two things to combine, it has to have the same measure, and the food here is kikeseves, the date size, and the drink is malalugma. So therefore, they're not the same measure, so they don't combine. However, Rav Nachman, who was a contemporary of Rav Chisda, says no, that's not correct. In Babel, in Babylon, he says no. We can even say it's the opinion of the Rabbanan, not Kamla, Rabbanan, Hasan, because the Rabbanan only said this rule that they have to have. That they would combine, even though that they are not exactly the same in the rules of the susceptibility for tumah and the amount of tumah. Elinim tumah, the shem tumah chadik. Maybe they only said that in regards to tumah because you know what? It's all one tumah, and therefore it doesn't make a difference if this one has this rule and that one has that rule. It's all tumah. But over here, where the reason that you require a date size is because that's the minimum amount that calms the eating and therefore the body, and therefore it's no longer an affliction. Well, actually, they said, so if you drink, it's not going to combine because you actually need that amount of food. And you didn't have that amount of food, you had less food. So the drink will not combine because it doesn't calm the body. And just as in Bavel, in Babylon, in the academies, Rav Chisda and Rav Nachman disagreed about this. In Eretz Yisrael, they have the same, because Rav Rish Lakish said, Rabbi Shui said the same thing as Rav Chisda said, that this is only the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, and our Mishnah that says that the drink and food don't combine. It's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, but the majority disagree. And the Tanan Klal and Yeshua, he made the comparison to Tumah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and to that, Rabbi Yochanan, the head of the academy in Israel, disagreed, and he said, the Chachamim only said that they'll combine in regards to Tumah. But over here, the reason why food requires a date size is so that it will calm a person having eaten something. This does not afford that, because if you have a half a date of food and some drink, they will not combine because it will not have that effect.
So where does that keep something like control?
I think it would count as a drink, and you would have to have the measure of a drink. Right. Yeah. If you drink it out of a cup as opposed to eat it with a spoon, then it's a drink. It's a soup. Well, yeah, if your soup is that kind of soup, if it's a broth, but if it's
you got clear chicken soup as opposed to
that's a broth.
I think body soup.
Right. I'm saying that's the idea. And in Hilchos Brachos we see similar. If you drink it out of a cup, that's not you happen to be drinking out of it. Right? That's a drink. So you have a lot of these fruit drinks that are just or the vegetable. It's just like what's a V8 or something. Yeah. So those would be a drink because they're made as a drink, and they would go by the measure of the drink. All right. Now we know as a general rule that all these things that we talk about when somebody transgresses a Torah prohibition, it's not this would apply for a shogeg, for somebody that did so inadvertently. When somebody did so inadvertently, that it would be held responsible and have to bring a chatas offering. For each one of the sins that somebody did, they would have to bring a separate chatas offering. Unless it is a he'elam echad. In one forgetfulness, they did the same classification of prohibition. We saw in Shabbos, each one of the malachas counts as separately, and forgetting that today was Shabbos, various halachas over there. So here we're going to have a similar question. Somebody forgot today, what is Yom Kippur? They wake up in the morning and they forget it's Yom Kippur, and they sit down and they have a coffee and toast. Okay, so I don't know how they made the toast, so that's a separate thing, right? But they had coffee and toast. Right. We're saying that we don't want to get into that they did it. Someone else made it for them. All they did was they ate and drank. So in one forgetfulness, they ate and drank. They only have to bring one sin offering. However, but if they forgot and they made their own food and they ate it, so now they did a malacha. They transgressed Yom Kippur by cooking, by starting a fire. So they did malacha and eating. So those are two separate classifications: the prohibition of eating and the prohibition of doing malacha, separate things. So chayiv shtei chatos. So they have to bring two sin offerings. What happens if they ate something that's inedible, or drank something that's not drinkable, or so they would be exempt. Similarly, shasat tzirad murius, if they drank brine or fish juices, potter. It's not really. Most people don't eat that. It's not an edible thing. You're gonna eat something. So the second part of the mission tells you that it has to be an edible food. If it's not an edible food, it's not edible. Amar Reish Lakish, mipnei malei nemra azhara be'inui. Reish Lakish says, why does it not say in the Torah an actual prohibition? Do not eat on Yom Kippur. Why does it say in the positive, and you shall afflict yourself? And then it says, and any person that does not afflict themselves, their soul will be cut off from its source. Okay, so the punishment, the curse is there. But why does it say it in such a manner? Why does it say, and you shall afflict your soul in the positive, and then a punishment in the negative? So it says, because grammatically, what do you expect it to say? What should it say? If it would just say don't eat, or don't eat and drink, achila b'kazayis, that would tell you don't eat, meaning an olive size. But the Torah wants the prohibition at a higher rate because it wants a kaseves, a date size, which is what will actually calm a person when they're hungry. If it says don't afflict, now that seems to say eat. So what is it supposed to say? Therefore it says afflict. Maskiv la Rabbi Shai. So Rabbi Shai said challenge, no, there is something to say. We have in the Torah words that mean prohibition. It says lest you shall, right? Or guard yourself from. Hishamir, hen. So guard yourself lest you will eat, or lest you will not afflict yourself, which indicates you have to afflict yourself. Like when it says in Kain Fisher Lulavi, that would mean multiple prohibitions because he's shomer, guard yourself, and pen, less. Those are going to be two loud. Maskefla Rabbi Barabai. So Rabbi asked, Nefta Rachmani his shomer b'mitzvahs inu. The Torah should have said, guard yourself in the mitzvah of affliction. In Cain is shomer the lav. No, that doesn't work either because when the Torah says guard yourself and then says a positive, then it's a positive mitzvah, not a prohibition, because it's telling you guard yourself in esrog, right? What it means is guard yourself to take an esrog on the first day of Sukkot. So that's a positive commandment. His shomer the lav. Only a guard yourself of a prohibition is a prohibition. His shomer the asay, but when the Torah says guard yourself to do this, that is a positive commandment. So again, we don't have a way to write it as a prohibition, as a negative commandment. Maskef lo Ravashi. So Ravashi said, no, there is something to say. Niftav al tasur mina inu. Don't turn away from the affliction. Kasha. It was okay. So that's a question that could have been, but again, it doesn't have the gist of it. And so that's not what the Torah wrote. It's not a contradiction to Rish Lakish's point, but the idea is that it maybe it could have written this. Tana Maisa Lemacha. However, the Brisa explains it that actually there is a prohibition for Inui, even though the Torah says it in a positive way. The Torah says, "And you shall afflict yourselves, your souls." It actually is a negative commandment. It says in the pasuk, and you will afflict your souls. And it also says, all manner of creative work shall not be done. So perhaps there's a kares, the severity of the punishment for eating, meaning for not causing affliction to self, is going to be the same also for malacha. And perhaps malacha is also going to have a kares. The prohibition of doing work on Yom Kippur is going to apply only to Yom Kippur itself, to the day, and not to the early acceptance of Yom Kippur earlier in the day. That's the Sefes Yantiv. We'll see this concept now, where we've seen the idea that when you bring in Yantiv early, you bring in Shabbos early, you bring in Yom Kippur early, that makes it Kodesh, and there's an obligation, a chiyuv, a mitzvah, to bring in Yantiv early. However, the punishment, the severity of the punishment of kares, where the soul is cut off from its source on account of the malacha, that does not apply to the tesefes, to the additional time. Because the Torah says anybody that does work on Yom Kippur, be'etzam hayom is in the midst of this day. It has to be the day itself. The punishment of kares is only for in the midst of his day. But for accepting the yontif early, and then therefore not being allowed to do malacha, yes, it's true that you're not allowed to do malacha, but the severity of the punishment will be. So he says, okay, perhaps perhaps there's no kares prohibition, a punishment for the prohibition of doing work on that extra time, the additional time of Yantiv. However, maybe the additional time that one accepts Yantiv, Yom Kippur, that would apply to the Inui, to the prohibition of food. And when the Torah says that there's kares for somebody who eats on Yom Kippur, that's even if they eat a bit earlier than Yom Kippur, when they accepted Yom Kippur already, and they ate, it would also be the kares prohibition. So therefore, we also have the pasuk that says, "For any soul that does not afflict themselves, in the midst of this day." So we see that it's on the day of Yom Kippur and Tosefes. The earlier time will not be included. Then the soul is cut off. Only when there's Itzuma Shiyam in the midst of that day, there's no kares on the Tosefes, on the additional. Now, so that's the punishment for the severity of the punishment, which the Torah says for somebody who does malacha, that works on Yom Kippur, somebody who does eats on Yom Kippur. There's kares, the soul is cut off from its source. So it says that applies to the Etzem HaYom, to the day of Yom Kippur itself, and not in the Tosefes. Well, is there even an obligation, a prohibition of doing work in the Tosefes? Okay, so the work being done on Yom Kippur is it has a severe punishment in Kares. And if you accept Yom Kippur early, that prohibition applies. Just the punishment doesn't. But there is a Torah prohibition to do malacha, to do work on the 9th day of Tishrei, even early on Yom Kippur, before Yom Kippur started, if you accept it early. So no, even the prohibition itself that says not to do work on Yom Kippur, it says that you shall not do work in the midst of this day, meaning only once it actually turns Yom Kippur. There is no prohibition of doing malacha on the additional time that someone has accepted Yom Kippur for themselves. Okay, so perhaps there is no punishment for either work or inui or eating prior to Yom Kippur, even if you accept Yom Kippur, and there isn't even a prohibition of work if you accept Yom Kippur early. However, perhaps there is a prohibition of eating if you accept Yom Kippur early. And I have a logical conclusion, I have a comparative conclusion. Melacha applies to Shabbos and Yom, right? Every Shabbos you're not allowed to do these 39 creative works. Every Yom Tov you may not. And so Melacha applies to Shabbos and Yom Tov. Eina Muzar allowed. There is no prohibition of Tosefes, of the additional time. But Inui, the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur, that's unique to Yom Kippur. It does not apply to Yom Tov. So, so isn't it obvious that they would not have a prohibition of eating at the additional time, and the Tosefes at the additional time they add Yom Tov? Because it's a very unique and new prohibition that applies only to Yom Kippur. And even the things that apply to everything else does not apply to the additional time. So for sure, the new and novel prohibition of not eating on Yom Kippur, that would only apply to Yom Kippur itself and not to the additional time that someone accepts Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, okay, great. So you tell us there's a prohibition of work on Yom Kippur. There's a prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur. There's no prohibition of work in the additional time that you give the Yom Tov. There's no prohibition of eating in the additional time. What's missing is that, but we don't even have a prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur itself, because we do have a positive obligation of affliction, but we don't have an azhara, a warning, meaning a prohibition. But the prohibition of eating in the mitzvah of inui, of afflicting oneself, how do we know that? So the Gemara says, because why did the Torah have to say? The Torah says, you shall afflict your soul and not do any malacha. That's in Bamidbar Chav Tes 20. Right? afflict your soul, which means don't eat, don't drink, and um, don't do work. And then when it talks about anybody who does work, this is in Vayikra Chav Gimel, anybody who does work on Yom Kippur, their soul will be cut off from its source. And over there as well, in the pasuk before that, when somebody doesn't fast, doesn't afflict themselves. So the Torah says that anybody who doesn't fast on Yom Kippur, the soul is cut off from itself. So why does the Torah have to, after it already said the prohibition of eating, meaning the mitzvah of eating, and the Torah already said a punishment of kares for somebody who doesn't fast, that should be sufficient. Why did the Torah have to repeat kares for somebody who doesn't work on Yom Kippur? The Gamar me'inu, because I can make the comparison and say inui does not apply. The fasting does not apply to any yontif. It's only one yontif, Yom Kippur, and yet the Torah gives it a punishment of kares. Malacha, the prohibition of work, which does apply to every Shabbos and every yontif. For sure, we'd have that severity. L'kol shekain. Isn't it obvious that it would have that punishment? Therefore, lama nema. So why did the Torah repeat the punishment of kares by malacha, mufne? So that makes it superfluous. It makes it excess. Lahakish v'lodim imenu zera shama. So it's to compare and to learn a comparative word from there. Nemar einish be'inu. It says punishment by the inu, by the affliction. The one who does not afflict themselves, they get kares. V'nemar einish b'malacha. And it says einish. It says the punishment of kares where somebody were to work on Yom Kippur. Ma malacha layanash elim kein hizir. Just as the work. The Torah first has to give a prohibition. So it gives a prohibition. If the Torah expresses the punishment, it means that the Torah prohibited it. So therefore, if the Torah tells you the punishment for someone who doesn't fast on Yom Kippur, that means that that included in that is the azhara, is the prohibition of not fasting. The Gemara says, not a good comparison. No, you know what? Throughout Yom Kippur, there are no exceptions to fasting. No exceptions whatsoever. It doesn't say the Kohen Gadol can eat. It doesn't say everybody has to fast. Whereas malacha, the work of Yom Kippur, malacha, the Torah says, no manner of created work shall be done, and yet there is ways and times that you have to do it. The Kohen Gadol in his avodah, right? He's shechting and he's burning and he's lighting fires. It's hutam. The Torah itself makes allowances. So perhaps the prohibition of the comparison is no good because the Torah may mention a prohibition by malacha, not because it's not excess, it's not superfluous. It needs to tell you that there's kares, even though there are exceptions. So which makes it a lesser prohibition, or seems to be a weaker prohibition. Nevertheless, there's kares for that. So that's why the Torah had to write by both, by inui, by not fasting, as well as by doing work, that there's kares. So rather, what's superfluous? But do the other way around. So the Torah should say, anybody who works on Yom Kippur, anybody who does work, manner of creating work on Yom Kippur, gets kares. Malacha gets kares. And if you get kares for that, for sure, for not fasting. The Gama Malacha, Ma Malacha Shehuta Mechlala Anush Kares. If Malacha, which has exemptions, it has exceptions, and yet if somebody who doesn't have the exemption, and does creative work gets kares. The fasting, which has no exceptions, like kosher cake, isn't it for sure that if somebody fasts, if somebody breaks their fast on Yom Kippur, that they get kares? Loma nema. So why did the Torah repeat the prohibition by by not fasting? Mufne, that makes it superfluous and extra. Lahakish v'ladim b'menek zeh Shabbat, to make a comparative connection through zeh Shabbat. Nemar eidish be'inu. It says the punishment of kares by the affliction, by inu. V'nemar eidish b'malach, and it says the punishment of kares by somebody who works on it. Ma malach anashve hizir, just as there by the work. Not only is there a punishment expressed in the Torah, but included in that, there's also the Torah's expresses a prohibition. Af inui anashve hizir. So too, if the Torah gave a punishment or expressed a punishment for someone who does not fast in Yom Kippur, included in that must be a hazhara, a prohibition as well. Ikal Mifra. The Gemara says no, that too is not a good comparison. Malacha is a general, universal type of prohibition. Shabbos, Yantif, Yom Kippur, they all have a prohibition of malacha, and therefore, perhaps that's why it gets kares. You can't tell me that the fact that there's kares by malacha and a prohibition. Therefore, when there's kares by fasting on Yom Kippur, that it must be that there's a prohibition as well. Not true, because this is unique. Malacha, but inui, fasting does not apply to any other Yom or Shabbos. So therefore, the Gemara, by making these comparisons and trying to find a superfluous statement by inui, of the punishment, trying to use that as proof or as a comparative text to say that there is an actual prohibition by inui, by fasting, where there isn't in the text. Right? The Gemara only says in the positive, you will afflict your soul, and it doesn't say, and you shall not, whatever the wording would be. But since it gives the anish kares, somehow we try to make a comparison and say that included in that must be also the prohibition. It's not there. Amar Ravina said, "Haitana etzem gama." So Ravina says actually it's just using a textual comparison in both places, in malacha and in inui and in fasting. The Torah says in the midst of this day. That's comparative to tell us that just as over there, when it says in the midst of this day, it's a prohibition, so to over here, when it said in the midst of this day, it means a prohibition. So the Gemara says it must be mufne. It must be that for some reason that's an extra word that's superfluous. The ilay mufne, because if it wasn't superfluous, it's not a good comparison. Because I can challenge that and show a difference. Like we just did in the previous statements, we made disassociative points in inui and malacha by pointing out why they should not be a comparison. So unless you have a superfluous word, this wouldn't be a good comparison. Indeed, it is extra because chamisha kroiksi. It says in the Torah 5 times. Malacha, in malacha, chad la'azhara. 1 to tell you the prohibition, don't work on Yom Tov, the yamama, while it's day. V'chad la'azhara d'leil. And 1 is to tell you don't do work on the prohibition, don't work on the night of Yom Kippur. V'chad la'inish yamama, v'chad la'inish d'leil. And 1 is to tell you that the punishment applies to work on the day of Yom Kippur. I wanted to tell you that the punishment applies to the work of the night of Yom Kippur. Still, I have a 5th one. What's that about? 1 is going to be superfluous. To compare the fasting to malacha, all of the malacha day and night, to tell you that just as by Malacha, there's a prohibition. So too, in regards to the fasting, there is a prohibition. Tomorrow we'll continue with other verses, other places of learning the prohibition of doing work on Yom Kippur itself. Sorry, the prohibition of fasting, for fasting on Yom Kippur.